I was recently talking to a senior structural engineer who has spent 30 years hovering over blueprints for some of our most critical bridges. He's the kind of guy who carries a slide rule in his head and views a 0.1% margin of error as a personal insult. But as we discussed the state of modern infrastructure, his usual stoic confidence was gone. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a frustrated whisper, and told me about a recent hiring round at his firm. He described one candidate, a young graduate with a sparkling resume from a top-tier university, who could speak fluently for 20 minutes about spatial equity and intersectional urbanism. Her vocabulary was impeccable. She used all the right buzzwords that make HR departments glow with pride. However, when he sat her down and asked her to calculate the shear force on a simple cantilever beam, a foundational task for any sophomore student, she froze. She didn't just struggle with the math. She seemed offended that the math was even being asked of her, as if the cold, hard physics of the universe were a microaggression against her lived experience. That moment wasn't just a quirky anecdote about a bad interview. It was a localized symptom of a systemic stroke. We are currently living through the long march, through our institutions, where the primary currency of success has shifted from technical mastery to ideological compliance. Whether it's a Boeing door plug blowing out at 16,000 feet or a power grid that gasps for air during a standard winter storm, these aren't accidents. They are the predictable results of an engineering culture that has begun to prioritize proper ideological plumage over the laws of physics. We are witnessing the systematic uninstallation of the meritocratic operating system that built the modern world, replacing it with a version of safetyism that protects emotional comfort while leaving our physical reality to rot. When the people designing our planes, bridges, and power grids know everything about equity statements but nothing about shear forces, the result isn't progress. It's a civilization-wide crash landing. That opening text, wow, it really just hangs in the air, doesn't it?
It feels less like an introduction and more like a final diagnosis.
A diagnosis. Yeah. Because we're not just talking about some minor issue or a political disagreement. The documents we've got in front of us, they're pointing to something much deeper.
It's what the text called a systemic stroke. And I think that's the perfect metaphor. It's this idea that our civilization is having a kind of neurological event.
A seizure, yeah. The body's still there, the roads, the buildings, the power lines, but the signals aren't getting through.
Exactly. The brain can't command the hand anymore. The competence, the actual ability to do things is it's eroding from the inside out.
So that's really the mission for this deep dive then. We have this stack of material economic papers, academic reports, even Reddit threads from engineers on the front lines. And we need to piece it together. We need to try and understand why these systems are breaking down. Why has safety, of all things, become a liability?
And maybe most importantly, how did we get to a place where administrative compliance seems more important than technical skill?
The form filler has conquered the bridge builder.
It sounds dramatic, but the evidence suggests it's not far from the truth. And I think we can break this down into three big areas.
Okay.
First, we need to look at what we're calling the bureaucratic tumor, this explosion of the administrative layer.
Right.
Then we'll connect that to how it's physically degrading our world in a section on institutional capture and infrastructure.
So the consequences.
The real world consequences, yes. And finally, we have to look at the human element, the death of anti-fragility. What is this culture doing to the next generation of builders and thinkers?
The bureaucratic tumor.
This is the one from the engineer in the Pacific Northwest.
That's the one. He's a retired systems engineer, 30 years in the business. His entire career was about one thing, making sure that when you flip a switch, the lights come on, period.
So he understands the grid as a physical machine, not a spreadsheet.
A living, breathing machine that obeys the laws of physics. And he told me about this high-level briefing he was in not long before he retired. It was about regional grid stability.
Okay.
Now, in the old days, a meeting like that would be full of electrical engineers, load balancing experts, linemen, the people who actually know how electrons move.
Not people with dirt under their fingernails.
Exactly. But he walks into this room, and it's just packed with people with these new, very impressive sounding titles.
Yeah.
Sustainability compliance officers, equity impact analysts, stakeholder engagement coordinators. He said you could barely breathe for the number of people whose jobs didn't exist 15, even 10 years ago.
The clipboard class, the oversight layer.
And here's where it all came to a head. They were discussing a new wind farm project, and one of the few actual engineers left in the room, he tries to raise a red flag, a purely technical issue.
Yeah.
He points out a synchronization flaw. Basically, the way they were planning to integrate this farm into the grid, it was going to create a major instability. If the wind dropped at a certain rate, the whole local system's frequency would go haywire.
So a physics problem, not a political problem, not an opinion.
Pure physics, a mathematical certainty. And you know what they told him?
Ask.
They told him, and this is a direct quote, that his concerns were, quote, not aligned with the regenerative narrative of the project.
The narrative.
The narrative. So they approved it, and a few months later, a cold snap hits.
Yeah.
Not a polar vortex, not some historic blizzard, just a normal cold Tuesday in winter. The instability, he predicted, it happened. It triggered a cascading failure. 3 days of blackouts, no heat, no lights.
Because the physics of the wire didn't care about their narrative.
The administrative bloat wasn't just inefficient. It wasn't just a line item on a budget. It was a physical barrier standing between expertise and public safety.
It's a wall of noise that the actual signal can't penetrate.
And when you choose the language of the office over the laws of physics, you are literally choosing darkness.
That story it's the perfect microcosm of this whole phenomenon, this engineering of incompetence. But it's so important that we zoom out from that one anecdote because it's easy for someone to say, oh, that's just one grumpy engineer.
Right. He's just resistant to change.
Exactly. But the data is just impossible to ignore. We're looking at a paper here that analyzes hiring trends in U.S. research universities.
Okay.
And it looks at the period between 1990 and 2022. Now, over those 3 decades, the number of tenured faculty, the people actually teaching classes and doing research, it grew. But it grew pretty much in line with student enrollment.
So a stable ratio.
It makes sense.
A stable, logical ratio. But the number of administrative positions. I've seen the chart. It's not a line. It's a rocket ship.
It is a hockey stick graph. It grew at 3.7 times the rate of faculty.
Wait, say that at 3.7 times?
3.7. For every one new professor hired to do the core mission of the university, they hired almost 4 new administrators to manage that professor?
To manage them, to audit them, to write reports about them.
To ensure their work is aligned with the narrative. You have 4 people overseeing the work of one person. The incentives are completely inverted.
And you see this in the corporate world too, right? It's
Yeah.
not just an academia problem.
We have data from Fortune 500 companies that shows the exact same trend. Back in the 80s or early 90s, the ratio of managers to engineers was about 1 to 7.
Okay, 1 boss for 7 doers.
A pretty healthy span of control. It allows for autonomy now. It's closer to 1 manager for every 3.5 engineers.
So we've literally doubled the number of bosses.
If it doubled the oversight and half the productivity. And this brings us to a really critical concept from the economic literature that you just have to understand to get this. It's called the Bowen effect.
Yeah, because the usual explanation you hear for rising costs in, say, higher education or healthcare is Baumol's cost disease.
Right. And Baumol's is the standard excuse. It's the go-to defense. The idea is simple enough. In some industries, you can't really increase productivity. The example is always a string quartet. It takes 4 musicians the same amount of time to play a Beethoven piece today as it did in 1800. You can't make them 2% more efficient next year.
Right. You can't automate Beethoven.
Exactly. But wages in the rest of the economy, like in a car factory, are going up because of automation and productivity gains. So to keep the musicians from quitting and going to work at the car factory, you have to pay them more. So costs naturally rise.
It's the blame the market argument.
It's the our hands are tied defense. But this other theory, the Bowen effect, it basically calls their bluff.
Okay. So what does Bowen say?
The Bowen effect argues that the massive cost increases we see aren't primarily driven by those external market forces. They're driven by decisions made inside the institution itself.
So it's not the economy, it's them.
It's them. Specifically, it points to 2 things: weak shared governance and what economists call agency problem.
Okay, agency problem. Let's define that in this context.
An agency problem is when the person making the decisions, the agent, has different incentives than the organization they're supposed to be serving.
Like a CEO using company money for a private jet.
Example. In a university context, think about a dean of student well-being. Their primary incentive isn't necessarily to keep tuition low or to make sure the physics lab gets new equipment.
Their incentive is to grow their own department.
To increase their own power, their own budget, their own influence. And how do you do that in a bureaucracy?
You hire more people to work under you, you build an empire.
You build an empire. You hire a vice dean of student well-being, who then hires 3 assistant directors of student well-being, who each need an administrative assistant. And the research we have here actually quantifies this.
So
It breaks down the cost increases. And it finds that for every $1 of cost increase that you can blame on Baumol's cost disease, the external market forces, there are over $2 in increases that come directly from these internal administrative choices, the Bowen effect.
Whoa. So for every dollar of inflation, there were $2 of pure bloat.
The paper even puts forward what it calls the pro-shared governance hypothesis. It suggests that the most cost-effective structure for a university is a balance of about 3 faculty members for every 1 administrator.
And we've completely inverted that.
We've gone the other way. We're now in a situation where, in many places, the administrators outnumber the teaching staff. And this is why costs explode and efficiency plummets. The compliance layer is literally eating the competence layer alive.
All this data, it provides the skeleton for what David Graeber wrote about in his book, Bullshit Jobs. He puts the human flesh on these numbers.
His taxonomy of these roles is it's devastatingly accurate. He talks about box tickers, for instance.
The box ticker, yes. These are the people whose entire job is to allow an organization to claim it's doing something that it's not actually doing.
Like the sustainability compliance officers from the grid story.
Exactly. They don't generate a single kilowatt of green energy. In fact, their meetings and their forms and their reports actively prevent the engineers from doing their jobs. But they produce a very nice, glossy report that says, look how sustainable we are.
The report is the product, not the energy.
Right. And then Graeber also talks about the taskmasters.
The taskmasters. These are the people whose primary role is to create work for other people. The middle managers who exist to manage other middle managers.
I found this story on a Reddit thread from a user called Move Difficult 1908. And it's a perfect example. He was on this huge project team at a tech company. The company decides to do layoffs.
Okay.
They lay off 17% of the project team. The actual engineers, the coders, the designers, the doers.
The people building the things.
But the project management organization, the PMO.
Yes. Completely untouched.
Not a single person. And he said, their entire job consisted of badgering us to update our status in Smartsheet. So the people actually doing the work get fired, while the people nagging them about paperwork all keep their jobs.
It's madness. There's another one in our notes about the project manager whose only real function was forwarding emails.
She would get a technical query from a client. And instead of trying to understand it or summarize it or add any value, she would just hit forward to the engineering team and type, please handle.
And was probably getting paid twice as much as them.
And the craziest part is, when she was finally laid off, she was genuinely deeply shocked. She thought she was indispensable.
Because in her mind, she was the node through which all communication flowed. She didn't realize she was just adding friction. And this all points to a concept that's really important: managerial feudalism.
Feudalism, that's a pretty strong word for an office environment.
In a truly capitalist system, the goal is profit maximization, right? You want the leanest, most effective team possible to achieve your goal.
Sure.
In managerial feudalism, the goal isn't profit, it's clout. It's internal status. A manager's power and prestige aren't measured by their team's output. They're measured by their team's size.
So it's about the size of your retinue.
It's purely feudal. As a VP, my path to becoming a senior VP isn't to lead a small, elite team that creates a breakthrough product. It's to build a sprawling empire of 50 people reporting to me, even if 40 of them are just box tickers and taskmasters.
Because having 50 direct reports looks good on the org chart. It makes you a lord with a large court.
And that is why the bureaucratic tumor grows. It's not a bug, it's a feature of the incentive system. The compliance layer is a parasite on the competence layer. And when that parasite gets big enough, it starts to dictate terms. Technical reality, physics, mathematics, logic, it all gets subordinated to bureaucratic reality.
And bureaucratic reality is just forms and narratives and alignments.
But as the people in that blackout discovered, the laws of thermodynamics don't really care about your regenerative narrative.
And that is a perfect, if terrifying, segue into our second section. Because this isn't just about wasted money or frustrating jobs. This is about the physical world we all depend on starting to fail. We're calling this section the fragility of infrastructure.
This is where we see the tumor starting to metastasize and cause real systemic damage.
Story. This one from the aerospace industry. This comes from a researcher, mid-career guy. He's been in the R&D labs for about 20 years.
So he's seen the shift happen in real time.
He's lived it. And he described the culture in his lab changing from what he called a culture of discovery to a culture of documentation.
Oof. Just that phrase alone tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? Discovery is about risk. Documentation is about avoiding risk.
He said that now, before he can even start a high-risk experiment, the kind that leads to breakthroughs, he has to navigate this absolute labyrinth of safety and inclusion audits. And these audits, they treat the possibility of failure not as a necessary part of the scientific method, but as a corporate liability to be eliminated.
They're trying to engineer the randomness and the serendipity out of science.
Yeah. And he gave this specific example that was just heartbreaking. There was this brilliant intern, a kid with a truly radical idea for a new kind of propulsion, high risk, high reward, the kind of crazy idea that just might work.
The stuff that changes the world.
Right. And instead of being given a budget in the corner of the lab and told, go see if you can break it, the intern was sent to a mandatory week-long seminar, Mitigating Risk in Collaborative Spaces, where they took this spark of genuine creativity and tried to smother it with bureaucratic procedure.
They crushed the instinct to build and replaced it with the instinct to comply. What happened to the intern?
He quit, went into high-frequency trading.
And that, right there, is the brain drain in action. We are systematically taking the people with the temperament to build the future, and we are putting them in systems that only want to manage the present. So they leave, they go to finance, or they start their own thing, they get out.
The researcher's final thought on it was the real clincher for me. He said, we are trading the future for a false sense of security today.
And if we connect that story to the broader theme, it's a perfect example of what the sources call institutional capture. And within that, there's a more specific process called goal displacement.
Okay, goal displacement. Talk me through that.
It's when an organization's primary original goal gets replaced by a secondary, often bureaucratic one. The stated mission of an aerospace company should be something like achieve engineering excellence to build the safest and most advanced aircraft.
Right. Build great planes.
Build great planes. But look at a company like Boeing. Where did they move their corporate headquarters to a few years ago?
To Arlington, Virginia, right outside D.C.
Exactly. They moved it away from their engineering hub in Seattle, away from the factory floor, and put it right next to the Pentagon and their regulators.
That's a pretty clear signal.
It's a physical manifestation of goal displacement. The goal is no longer engineering. The goal is lobbying. The goal is political management. The goal is securing government contracts.
So the mission shifts from how do we build a better plane to how do we keep the regulators happy and the federal money flowing.
And that mindset, when you apply it to critical infrastructure like the energy sector, is an absolute recipe for disaster. We've got this very dense but really important paper here from the UNFCCC and CAPSARC.
The one on energy poverty.
Yes. And the correlation they found is just, it's stark.
What did they find?
A very strong, very clear, positive correlation between the stringency of a country's climate policy and the price of its electricity. To put it simply, the more regulations, mandates, and subsidies you pile onto the grid, the more expensive electricity becomes for the end user.
And we're not just talking about your bill going up by a few dollars.
This is creating a genuine crisis of energy poverty. In some parts of Europe, depending on the country, they're seeing between 5 and 40% of the population unable to afford to adequately heat their homes.
40%, that's a developing world number.
And that's exactly the term the source material uses, the third worldization of infrastructure.
That felt a little extreme when I first read it, but the more you look at the reliability data, the more it makes sense.
It's a descriptive term. The analysis argues that we're forcing our grids to leapfrog to renewable energy sources without having the necessary foundation of baseload power to support them.
Okay, let's get a little technical for a second, because this is really important. Can you just unpack that for us? The difference between baseload and intermittency, and why that drives cost up so much?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the core of the whole problem. So baseload power is your foundation. It's the power that is always on, 247, rock solid. Think nuclear, coal, natural gas, large-scale hydro. You turn the plant on, it hums along and provides the raw, heavy lifting power for the entire grid.
Okay. Stable and predictable.
Intermittent power is wind and solar. They only produce electricity when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining.
Which is obvious, but what are the hidden costs?
The hidden cost is redundancy. If you build a grid that relies heavily on wind, you also have to build a complete backup grid for all the times the wind isn't blowing. That means you either need massive, incredibly expensive battery arrays, or you need to have natural gas plants sitting idle, ready to fire up at a moment's notice.
So you're paying for two entire infrastructures to do the job that one used to do.
Exactly. You're paying for the wind farm and you're paying for the gas plant that backs it up. The cost is immense. And more than that, it introduces fragility. You're taking a simple, robust system and replacing it with a complex, delicate one that's dependent on the weather.
And as we saw in the first story, if the bureaucracy running that complex system doesn't understand the physics, it breaks.
It breaks catastrophically. And on top of all that, we're ignoring the new supply chain risks. This whole transition depends on a handful of critical minerals: lithium, cobalt, copper, rare earths,
Right.
many of which have huge environmental costs to mine and are controlled by geopolitical adversaries. We're essentially trading one form of energy dependence for another, arguably more fragile one.
Why? I mean, if the economics are this bad and the reliability is this questionable, why is the entire institutional world pushing this so hard?
And that question leads us directly to the big science connection. There's a source here from the Heritage Foundation that gives a fantastic historical overview of this.
Okay.
It traces the fundamental shift in how science has been done over the last century, from what it calls small science to big science.
And small science is what? The lone inventor in their garage.
It's more about a decentralized model. Independent researchers, small university labs, private corporate R&D, diverse funding sources. Big science is the opposite. It's the Manhattan Project, model centralized, federalized, massive government-led initiatives.
Okay.
But to unlock that level of federal funding, the system needs a powerful justification. It needs a mechanism.
And that mechanism is fear. A crisis.
It's moral panic. You need a grand existential crisis to justify the billions and later trillions in grants. During the Cold War, it was the missile gap, then it was the Sputnik moment and the STEM crisis, and now it's the climate emergency.
So if you're a researcher or a university and you want to get a piece of that massive funding pie, you have to frame your work in the context of the current approved crisis.
The mechanism that directly fuels the bureaucratic bloat we talked about in Section 1, it's a line item in these grants called indirect costs.
Okay, this is the part that made my jaw drop. Explain how indirect costs work.
Simple. When the federal government gives a university, say, a $1 million grant for a specific research project, they don't just give the $1 million to the scientists for lab equipment and salaries. They give an additional amount to the university's central administration just for hosting the research. It's for overhead.
And what kind of percentage are we talking about?
It can be 50, 60, sometimes over 100%. So for every dollar of actual research funding, the government is paying another 50, 60 or more cents directly to the university's administrative budget.
So the federal grants are literally paying the salaries of the compliance officers and the deans of initiatives and the stakeholder engagement coordinators.
They are the fuel for the tumor. The universities have become addicted to this overhead money. It's what they use to hire the ever-expanding ranks of administrators.
God, it's a self-licking ice cream cone.
It is the perfect closed loop. The crisis narrative generates the grant money. The grant money, through indirect costs, funds the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy then has a vested financial interest in perpetuating and amplifying the crisis narrative to ensure the money keeps flowing.
And the inevitable result of that is that any dissenting scientific view gets crushed.
If you're a geologist or an atmospheric physicist who says, hang on, the data here is more nuanced, or actually grid stability requires us to maintain baseload power, you're not just having a scientific disagreement anymore.
You're threatening the business model. You're threatening the revenue stream that pays the salaries of your own bosses.
And so you get defunded, you get marginalized, you get labeled a denier. An intellectual echo chamber is created not for scientific reasons, but for financial ones. And it's an echo chamber that is, by design, deaf to technical reality.
That is profoundly cynical. But it explains everything. It explains the stubborn disconnect between the official narrative and the physical reality.
It explains why the system is so powerful and so incredibly resistant to any kind of course correction.
Which brings us to our third and final section. And honestly, this is the one that worries me the most. Because you can, in theory, rebuild a power grid. You can fix a broken budget. But if you break the minds of the next generation of people who are supposed to maintain the world...
That's a much harder problem to solve. Maybe an irreversible one.
Section 3. The death of anti-fragility. This is about our education system and the psychology of risk, failure, and competence.
This is where we look at the human capital that underpins everything else.
I have one last story to set the stage. This is a reflection from a structural engineering professor. He's old school, been teaching since the early 90s.
He's from the generation that still use slide rules.
That's the one. And he starts by just laying out the budget reality at his university. He says his department's budget for lab equipment, the actual physical machines you need to teach students how to test the strength of concrete and steel, that budget has been totally flat for a decade.
Yes, the administrative budget has not been flat.
In that same 10-year period, the university hired 12 new deans for various initiatives.
The Bowen effect, right there in plain sight.
But the real conflict for him came in the classroom. He was trying to fail a student. And this student, to be clear, could not perform the basic calculations for stress loads on a beam.
Which, if you're going to design a bridge, is kind of the one thing you absolutely have to know how to do.
It's not a nice to have. It's a non-negotiable prerequisite for not killing people.
Oh.
So he fails the student, and a few days later, he's called into a meeting, not with the department head, with someone called a student success coordinator.
The title itself tells you everything. The goal isn't academic rigor. The goal is success, which means graduation.
He sits down, and this coordinator tells him that his grading metrics are exclusionary, that he's not creating an inclusive learning environment. And he was explicitly told he needed to adjust his pedagogy to ensure equitable outcomes.
Which is just the most astonishingly Orwellian way of saying, lower the standards so everyone passes.
And he said in that moment, he had this horrifying realization. The collapse of standards wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was the explicit goal. And reading that, I just got a chill down my spine. Because that kindness in the classroom, that becomes systemic cruelty the first time an incompetent graduate designs a balcony that collapses.
That phrase, kindness becomes systemic cruelty, that is the absolute heart of this entire problem. And it connects directly to this concept called safetyism, which is laid out so well in the book, The Coddling of the American Mind.
Okay, so define safetyism for us.
No, it's a profound moral shift. Safetyism is the elevation of emotional safety above all other values. That includes truth, competence, free inquiry, and resilience. It's the belief that you have a right to be protected from ideas or feedback that make you uncomfortable.
So it recategorizes intellectual or emotional discomfort as a form of harm.
A form of violence, even. It's the mindset of the candidate in our opening story who experienced a math problem not as a challenge, but as a microaggression. She didn't just feel confused, she felt unsafe.
Right.
And the source identifies these three great untruths that are the pillars of this new mindset. The first one is, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
Which is the literal opposite of how biology and psychology actually work.
It's the opposite of anti-fragility. Our immune systems, our muscles, our minds, they all require stressors and challenges to grow stronger. By protecting a student from ever failing, you're not making them safe. You're making them brittle, fragile.
Okay, what's the second untruth?
Always trust your feelings.
Yeah.
This is the untruth of emotional reasoning. It says that your subjective feelings are a reliable guide to objective reality. If I feel that the test was unfair, then it was unfair, regardless of the fact.
On the third.
Life is a battle between good people and evil people. This is tribalism. It creates an us versus them mentality that makes it impossible to engage with criticism. If you give me a failing grade, it can't be because my work was substandard. It must be because you are a bad person and I am a good person.
And when you take that whole psychological package, the fragility, the emotional reasoning, the tribalism, and you inject it into the high-stakes world of corporate R&D, you get total paralysis.
You get what happened at Google. There's a great source on this from the newsletter, Not Boring. It's called The Maze is in the Mouse.
Right. This is about the code red they declared when ChatGPT came out.
It's the perfect case study in institutional sclerosis. You have to remember, Google invented the core technology behind these new AI models. The T in ChatGPT stands for transformer. Google's researchers published that number years before OpenAI.
So they had a massive head start. Why did they launch a product?
Because of safetyism, because of a culture of pathological risk aversion. A former Google engineer named Praveen Seshadri described the internal culture perfectly. He said, every single line of code is viewed not as an opportunity, but as a risk.
A liability.
A liability. To get even a minor new feature launched requires more than 15 separate approvals. They were paralyzed by reputational risk. They were terrified the AI might say something biased or offensive or unsafe.
So they chose the safety of doing nothing over the risk of innovation.
And they lost their lead. shocker. Almost all of the original authors of that groundbreaking Transformer paper, they've left Google, they went to competitors like OpenAI, or they started their own companies.
The anti-fragile talent fled the fragile institution.
Because builders want to build. They don't want to spend their lives in meetings getting permission to build. And this connects to the final concept from the engineering of incompetence source, which really ties all the class dynamics together. The concept of luxury beliefs.
This is a really crucial idea. Can you explain it?
A luxury belief is an idea or an opinion that confers status on the upper class while inflicting costs on the lower classes. It's a form of virtue signaling that the believer is personally insulated from the consequences of.
Okay, give me an example in this context.
The push for equitable math. This is the movement in public education to de-emphasize or even eliminate advanced courses like calculus because not all demographic groups pass them at the same rate.
Right.
The well-off people at elite universities or in policy think tanks who advocate for this, it costs them nothing. In fact, it enhances their status. It makes them look progressive and compassionate.
But where do they send their own children to school?
They send them to expensive private schools that have the most rigorous, demanding math programs they can find.
So they're promoting a belief system for the general public that they would never subject their own children to.
It is the definition of asymmetric risk. The decision makers, the university administrators, the consultants, the student success coordinators, they don't suffer the consequences when the bridge fails or the power grid goes down. They've decoupled their authority from any real-world consequence.
They get to play a status game, and the rest of us have to live in the crumbling physical reality the game creates.
And that is why the systemic stroke doesn't self-correct. The parts of the brain causing the seizure are insulated from the pain.
Cap. We started with the bureaucratic tumor, this explosion of administrators and box tickers who are draining resources and creating friction.
Then we looked at how that tumor leads to institutional capture and the fragility of infrastructure, where political narratives start to overwrite physical laws, leading to what we've called a third worldization.
And finally, we looked at the death of anti-fragility, how a culture of safetyism is producing a generation of potential leaders and builders who are terrified of risk, allergic to failure, and unable to handle the rigors of maintaining a complex civilization.
It's a sobering picture, to say the least. It's a diagnosis of a society that is forgetting the difference between doing the work and performing the rituals of work.
So, as we wrap this deep dive, what's the final thought? What's the thing you want the listener to really sit with?
I think we all tend to operate under a dangerous assumption. We assume that civilization is the baseline, that the lights stay on and the planes fly and clean water comes out of the tap just because that's how things are. We treat it like it's a law of nature, like gravity.
It's not a natural state. It's a constant active effort. It requires competence.
It requires relentless maintenance. And what all this material suggests is that we are no longer performing that maintenance. We are, in fact, burning through the seed corn of a previous, more competent era. We are running on the fumes, on the momentum of the meritocratic systems that we have spent the last 30 years dismantling.
And you can only coast on momentum for so long before you grind to a halt.
And the provocative thought I want you to carry with you from this is this. We are currently behaving like heirs, spending down a massive inheritance we don't know how to earn back. If the knowledge of how to maintain these complex systems is lost to a generation trained only in compliance, at what specific point does the decline become irreversible?